hope the dire situation that I've painted there is entirely inaccurate, and I will be proven wrong, and the new government will act with restraint and assure the Russian-speaking regions that their rights are guaranteed, and so on. The one real problem with that is that the current government is essentially made up of the opposition that existed back in November and December. But they, to a large extent, lost control over the crowds in December and January, when much more radical elements started taking control of the streets, and essentially torpedoed a number of the arrangements that were being negotiated by the more moderate leadership of the opposition. And there is every bit of evidence that these groups, these more radical groups, are not satisfied with the current government any more than they were with Yanukovych. The other thing that I should add to that is that Yanukovych was, from the beginning of his elections, committed to signing an agreement with the European Union. He was a pro-European candidate. He was not a pro-Russian candidate. He backed out of the agreement, in essence, because the Europeans, when they presented him in November with their accession agreement, gave him nothing. They essentially said, we will integrate you into the European Union, but that means that you have to drop all tariffs, all protective measures with regard to your economy, and furthermore, that you can have no trade agreement with Russia whatsoever. And on top of that, despite the fact that they know that the Ukrainian economy is currently $30 billion in the hole, offered no money whatsoever. That's understandable. The Europeans don't have much money, and the Greeks certainly would be very upset if a non-member like the Ukraine were to get a bailout from the European Union, but they can't get a bailout for themselves. So it's understandable why they would do that. But in that context, Yanukovych, for understandable reasons, said, I cannot sign this agreement because there is complete unanimity among economists, among leaders in the European Union, among leaders in the Ukraine itself, that the industries that currently exist in the Ukraine would go bankrupt overnight if they had to compete without protection within the European Union. Just as East German industries went bankrupt overnight when they had to compete with West German industries. They simply can't compete. And that means that those workers would be overnight thrown into unemployment. And that would create enormous social tensions. And in the absence of some kind of financial bailout to help him deal with that, he simply couldn't do it. And then when Putin came along and said, well, we'll give you $15 billion, no strings attached, to deal with your problems, the appeal of that offer was fairly obvious, and thus he went with it. That hasn't changed. The European Union is no more likely to offer a generous package of aid today than it was back in November. The only possibility at this point is a bailout from the IMF. Now, the bailout from the IMF, which would pay off the Ukraine's debt, would come with very serious strings attached. And those serious strings attached would be a drastic austerity program, meaning pushing down all social services, lowering wages, and so on and so forth, none of which are going to make the population happy either, which is, again, part of the reason why Yanukovych wouldn't sign on to it. Meaning that there's every indication that the current government is not going to be any more inclined towards signing the European agreement, unless it changes rather drastically, than the previous government was. In which case, the whole thing will start from scratch once again. And the problem with all of these revolutions, including this current one, was very nicely summarized by Barrington Moore Jr. In his book, The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, in which he argued that one of the problems with understanding revolutions, and one of the reasons why they often give rise to simplified interpretations of what these revolutions were about, what caused them, and so on, is that those that begin a revolution, those that ultimately make a revolution, and those that eventually benefit from the revolution are usually entirely different people, entirely different sets of interests. And that seems to be fairly evident already. We don't know who's going to ultimately benefit from this particular revolution. We'll have to wait for several years to see that. But what we can see is that this revolution started with relatively modest aims as a protest movement in favor of European integration, but very quickly was taken over by elements that had nothing to do with that. And the strongest elements in the last couple of weeks seem to have been the more neo-fascist nationalists that don't view either the Russians or the Europeans particularly favorably. They view the Russians as their former oppressors, and with good justification, and see the Europeans as a decadent, secularist, corrupted society that will bring nothing but homosexuality and bad television and so on and so forth to the Ukraine. In other words, they are true nationalists that want nothing to do with either the European Union or the Russian Federation. And they have very strong ties to the long history of neo-Nazism in that region of the world, which is making a lot of people in that part of the world rather nervous. Sorry to keep taking all this time up, but I think it's somewhat important that we think about these matters. And certainly, if you are taking a course on international relations, it would be negligent not to address these kinds of issues. What I'm going to do today is to look at North-South dynamics, and in doing so, we'll touch on another few major crises that are going on at the moment, and hopefully cast some light on what's going on there. In particular, of course, in the last couple of days, Venezuela has once again been in the headlines because of excessive rioting. And aside from that, we have problems throughout the world in terms of stability, ranging from Central African Republic to South Sudan, to Somalia, to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, what all of these countries have in common, all of these regions have in common, Ukraine perhaps less so, is that they are all part of the global South. They are all what are generally referred to as less developed countries. Less developed countries. And less developed countries, for the most part, tend to face problems with poverty, obviously, instability, authoritarianism, human rights violations, and in extreme cases, the emergence of failed states, the absence of political authority altogether. And given that these major problems are at the core of the problems of the international system, poverty and instability gives rise, on the one hand, to authoritarianism and human rights violations, but on the other hand, to massive outflows of migrants. Both economic migrants, those seeking to escape poverty by moving to other parts of the world, and political refugees, those seeking to escape authoritarian governments and the human rights violations that they unleash on their opponents. And these flows of migrants, in many cases, have the ability to undermine the stability of their neighbors, as is currently happening with the neighbors of Syria, where the massive inflow of refugees from Syria into countries like Lebanon in particular are making it very likely that Lebanon will itself descend into civil war and conflict. And of course, the conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims in Iraq has already been, to a significant extent, heated up as a result of that war in Syria between their relative brethren. Afghanistan is perhaps the best example of how this doesn't only affect the immediate neighbors of these states that have to deal with poverty and instability, but has global repercussions. Has global repercussions in that the flow of immigrants out of these regions ultimately ends up in Western Europe or North America. And we've seen plenty of evidence of what people are willing to go through to escape regions of the Middle East and North Africa in order to have the vague dream of being able to work and prosper in the European Union, including piling onto small boats with hundreds of people, more than those boats are able to carry, to make it across the Mediterranean, with many drowning on the way across the oceans. And of course, we see the impact of huge flows of illegal immigrants into the United States on a regular basis as well. These are, for that reason, core problems in the international system. And it's therefore rather important that we understand what less developed countries are, how they got there, and what can be done in order to turn them into developed countries, as some indeed have. Your textbook starts with the example of comparing Zambia and South Korea. It points out that in 1960, I think it mentions 1964 as the date, the standard of living of South Korea and the standard of living of Zambia were roughly the same. Today, South Korea is a member of the Organization for the OECD, Organization for Cooperation and Development. Whereas Zambia has, since that time, generally moved backwards and is today one of the poorest countries in the international system. How do we get more of these poor countries out of their state of poverty? Well, to do that, we have to first understand how they got there to begin with. And let me look at a couple of different factors to explain this. One factor is geography. There are many economic theories that explain why it is more difficult to develop in some regions than it is in others. Fertile soils, plentiful natural resources, natural boundaries, protect you from your neighbors, good ports and port facilities, and so on and so forth, are all things that facilitate the development of certain countries, and in their absence, make it much more difficult for other countries to undergo a process of development. But the basic answer, or the basic proposition that geography determines whether countries are poor or rich, or whether they are less developed or developed countries, doesn't hold water. And one reason it doesn't hold water is that while most poor countries are in the South, in fact, I would go so far as to say that just about all countries that are at the bottom end of the social ladder are in the global South, not all countries in the South are poor. And we would therefore have to figure out why some countries, such as Botswana, for example, neighboring Zambia, are doing considerably better than their neighbors. If we can't blame that on geography, we have to find some other factors that explain these differences. In the case of Zambia and Botswana, they're both landlocked. The only difference really is that Zambia has a much more plentiful supply of copper, which has been its dominant industry. And that would, if anything, one would think, make it more wealthy, not more poor. But things don't always work out that simply. What other factors can explain why certain countries are rich and others are poor? Well, let's look at a set of domestic factors that might explain this. Domestic factors such as the existence of infrastructure, the sanctity of private property, stable governments, those countries that have invested heavily in infrastructure and that guarantee the sanctity of private property and that have stable governments generally are able to perform much better than their counterparts that do not. Economic diversification requires, at least to some extent, trade of one sort or another. And trade, in turn, requires certain basic facilities to accommodate that trade, such as roads to get various products from their place of production to processing plants, such as power facilities, to facilitate the processing of these materials or products, port facilities in order to get those products to international markets, as well as communications technologies and so on and so forth. In the absence of these kinds of infrastructure, development becomes extremely difficult. You might be able to grow the best coffee in the world in whatever back or region of the world you may find yourself in, but if there are no roads to get that to the market, it's not going to do you a heck of a lot of good. And if there's no port facilities in the nearest cities to get them to international markets, again, international coffee buyers will get their coffee elsewhere. These are basic prerequisites, but there are prerequisites that don't exist everywhere. And why don't they exist everywhere? Well, one part of it, or one part of the explanation, is that one important prerequisite for the creation of infrastructures are, among other things, stable governments and the sanctity of private property. Only stable governments can borrow the kind of money necessary to build modern port facilities, airports, communications systems, and so on and so forth. And furthermore, stable governments are required in order to guarantee the sanctity of private property. Now, why would private property be so key to all of this? As many have argued, and as we've discussed it in various situations previously, private property, or the sanctity of private property, can certainly become a problem in some instances. We'll discuss that in a bit more detail as we move forward. But on many levels, it is an absolute prerequisite for the ability of those that own a piece of property to make investments in it. Why would you bother plowing up a field and planting a crop and doing all of the work to maintain that crop and to harvest that crop? If before you get to harvest it, that piece of land could be seized from you by your neighbor, by some powerful bureaucrat in the next town, or by the state outright, or by some bunch of bandits. Or if you couldn't count on being able to keep the product of that field safe after you've harvested it, because of the existence of bandits and so on and so forth. The reality is that in the absence of these kinds of guarantees, you would not make that kind of an investment. And just as this is true of a basic subsistence agriculturalist, it is true of virtually every other level of economic activity. Investments are only possible for individuals insofar as they can have some reasonable guarantee that they will be able to harvest the benefits of those investments. Because investments always mean putting in money now in order to hopefully get more money out of it later. If there's no guarantee that you're going to get more money out later, or that you'll even get your original investment back out of it, nobody's going to invest. This, by the way, is also a problem that the Ukraine currently faces. Nobody's in charge of the Ukraine. Even the IMF is going to be unlikely to be willing to lend money to a government that doesn't seem to control its own people. So again, well, that's a different story, but you get the general picture. Now, if this is true, why would all governments simply invest in infrastructure, guarantee the sanctity of private property, and so on? Well, to a certain extent, this becomes a chicken and egg question. Governments can remain stable insofar as they're in control of a stable economy, and therefore have regular access to tax revenues and so on, can afford to pay off their security establishment, and can maintain themselves stable. In the absence of that, they're not likely to be stable. And therefore, it's easy to say, well, we need a stable government to guarantee property rights, and that's all good and fine and true. But if you don't have a stable government, how do you create such a stable government? Well, to create a stable government, you first have to create a stable economy with a regular tax base. And that the absence of such a regular or such a productive economy is essentially the problem that you're trying to solve to begin with. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem in this regard. But aside from that, there are a number of reasons why some countries are not engaging in development, are not investing in their futures, and are for that reason not particularly growing. And many have argued that this has a great deal to do with the local elites. That local elites in some contexts have an interest in development, and in others do not. And a good comparison in this regard, one that's also mentioned in your text, is to look at the difference between North America and South America. North America and Canada and the United States are clearly within the developed world, whereas South America as a whole is, while there are big differences between countries like Chile and Argentina and others like Bolivia or Nicaragua, still very much in the global South with far lower standards of living. Why is that? Well, many argue that it has a great deal to do with the nature of those elites. In particular, with the fact that the pattern of development in South America was such that it created an extremely inegalitarian division of wealth. An extremely inegalitarian division of wealth. Pretty easy to understand why that was the case. If you remember back to our discussion of colonialism in Latin America, essentially the Spanish, when they settled Latin America, did not settle it as a whole, but encouraged members of their elite to move to South America and encouraged them by offering them enormous landed estates, as well as enormous grants of cheap labor in the encomienda system, in order to enrich themselves. And that essentially created an economy or a social structure based on the one hand, enormous plantations with a handful of owners that ran them, and an enormous army of workers, indentured servants, and in some cases even slaves, that worked these plantations. The other category were primarily mining interests, engaged in very labor-intensive mining operations, such as the mining of silver and gold in various parts of Latin America. But again, mining operations tend to be controlled by very narrow elites and tend to depend on a large and plentiful supply of cheap, untrained labor. Now, if this is the social structure that enriches you as a dominant elite within a country, and these elites lived like kings throughout the history of Latin America. The wealthy in Latin America are not at all poor. They're fabulously wealthy. Why would you have any interest in ever changing that? Why would you want to invest in education? You might want to invest in infrastructure insofar as it is absolutely necessary for you to get your product to market. But when it comes to things like education, public health, and so on and so forth, you have absolutely no interest in it at all. In fact, if anything, you're likely to be against it. Why? Because if the government were to start to get busy on trying to build universities and primary and secondary schools and so on and so forth, what would they require in order to do that? Taxes. And who would pay those taxes? Presumably that very tiny, very wealthy elite, because the peasants that are, or slaves or indentured servants certainly aren't paying much in the way of taxes. Now, how would this education and healthcare and so on and so forth benefit that tiny elite that would be asked to pay all of that? Well, the answer is it probably wouldn't. And in fact, it might even hurt them. It might even hurt them in that educated workers are better at organizing themselves in order to push up their wages, are better at demanding better treatment and things along those lines. So all of your interests are in fact quite the opposite. You're benefiting from the current status quo and are not likely to want to change that. And indeed, that has been the case for much of Latin America, is that throughout the 500 years or so that Europeans have governed Latin America, the elites remain a fairly small European, small elite of European origin, and the vast majority of the populations of countries ranging from Argentina all the way up to Haiti remain largely dispossessed and living in relative degrees of poverty. There is no real interest in promoting development. We'll get back to Latin America because Latin America is a bit more complicated, certainly than that currently. But if you compare that to North America, the main difference is that in North America, settlements tended to be smaller, or the economy was based more on small-scale agriculture. The family farm became the key institution in North America, in the United States, as well as in Canada, meaning that those societies were much more egalitarian. You get egalitarian social structures tend to have a greater likelihood of being able to sustain democratic systems of government. Democracy in an environment where 1% of the population controls 99% of the land or resources of the country don't lend themselves very well to democracy for obvious reasons. If people were allowed to vote, they vote in parties that would try to get to equalize that distribution of wealth. And that would certainly not be in the interest of the dominant elites. And since those dominant elites control, in many cases, their own military institutions, if not the military of the country, they're not likely to tolerate democracy for very long. A more egalitarian system, on the other hand, is likely to lead to more stable government institutions, and it's also likely to lead to an environment in which those that reside within the country are much more interested, or the larger majority of them are interested in the education of their children, in health care, and so on, and are therefore able to push those kinds of programs through. So the nature of elites certainly has an impact. A second factor that has a major impact are what political scientists often call cleavages. Cleavages are divisions within societies. And those societies that are relatively homogeneous, religiously, ethnically, tribally, and so on, generally have a substantial advantage over those that have deep divisions, deep cleavages within their borders. This is somewhat of a complicated topic, and one that we could take up in much more detail in a course on domestic politics. But it's not all cleavages within societies that are problematic. There are, of course, lots of societies that are divided on a religious basis, and that nonetheless have been able to develop fairly effectively, and where that religious division has not caused major problems, at least not in the last couple of centuries. A good example that comes to mind is Germany, which has been divided since the 30 Years' War relatively evenly between Catholics and Protestants. But religion has not been a strong factor in political conflict in Germany, and it certainly hasn't restrained Germany from its economic development. It becomes much more problematic when these cleavages tend to coincide with one another. In other words, what we see in Germany in the division between Catholics and Protestants is a cleavage that divides society roughly in half. But there are other divisions in Germany that tend to downplay the importance of that division, such as class.